There are castles that look haunted, long before anyone tells you they are. Glamis is not really one of them. Approach it across the farmland of Angus, and there is nothing ruined or abandoned about the place. The lawns are cared for, the stonework is magnificent, and its towers rise above the trees with the confidence of a house that has been occupied for centuries. From a distance, it is almost too picturesque for its reputation, the sort of castle that seems to belong on the cover of an old book, rather than at the centre of stories about devils, hidden rooms, and the dead. Yet Glamis has always had a problem. There seems to be rather more of the castle than anyone can comfortably account for. One of the oldest stories tells of guests who became curious about the windows. From outside, they could see row upon row of them scattered across the towers and wings. But once inside, the arrangement of the castle became so confusing that they could no longer work out which room belonged to which window. Eventually, somebody suggested a simple experiment. They would go through Glamis and hang a cloth from every window they could reach, then return to the grounds and see whether they had found them all. They worked their way through the castle, opening rooms and climbing staircases, marking each window as they went. When they were satisfied that there could be no others, they stepped outside and looked back at Glamis. There were still windows, without anything hanging from them. Somewhere inside the castle, apparently, were rooms they had been unable to enter. They went back inside and searched again. Retracing their steps through corridors they had already walked, and opening doors they were certain they had already tried. The missing rooms could not be found. There is no reason to treat the story as a documented architectural survey, and different versions have been told over the years, but it hardly matters. Glamis is exactly the sort of place in which such a story could survive, because once you are inside it, certainty about where you are seems remarkably easy to lose. Sir Walter Scott discovered something of that when he stayed at Glamis as a young man. He was shown to his room through such a bewildering succession of apartments, passages, and stairways that once the servants had left him alone for the night, the castle began to feel much larger than it had during the day. Somewhere beyond his room were the family, the servants, and the ordinary life of the house. But between himself and them lay so much darkness and so many unfamiliar rooms that they might as well have been miles away. He later remembered feeling himself too far from the living and somewhat too near the dead. Scott did not need to see a ghost. Glamis had already done enough. That same confusion of rooms and passages lies at the heart of one of the castle's oldest tales, because somewhere within Glamis, according to tradition, there is a chamber where a card game has been going on for centuries. The man sitting at the table is remembered as Earl Beardie. His exact identity has become confused in the telling, but the character folklore has preserved is much clearer. A powerful nobleman with a vicious temper, a love of gambling, and very little patience when anybody refused him. One Saturday evening, Beardie wanted to play cards. The hour was growing late, however, and midnight would bring the Sabbath. His companions had played long enough. Whatever Beardie offered, threatened or shouted, nobody was prepared to continue once Sunday began. At first he tried to persuade them. When that failed, persuasion became mockery, and mockery became anger. One by one, the men withdrew, until Beardie was left staring across a table at an empty chair. His cards were ready, his money was waiting. All he lacked was another player. In his fury, he declared that if nobody at Glamis would play with him, he would play with the devil himself. A knock came at the door. It is difficult to imagine a better moment for an old story. The hour is late. The castle is quiet. A man has just challenged the devil to join him. and somewhere beyond the thick walls, someone is waiting to be admitted. A servant went to answer. Outside stood a stranger. Nobody recognized him, and nobody had heard a horse approaching the castle. He had arrived without announcement, apparently alone, at exactly the moment Earl Beardie required another player. When the stranger learned what was wanted, he agreed to the game. Beardie led him into a private room and closed the door. For a while, those elsewhere in the castle heard nothing that would have caused alarm. There was the occasional movement of a chair, and the muted sound of voices behind the heavy door. Cards fell upon the table. The game continued. Then Beardie began to shout. Whatever happened to his luck, it had deserted him. His voice grew louder as the night passed. He accused the stranger of cheating and cursed him across the table. But the other man's voice remained strangely calm. That calmness seemed to have made the scene worse. Beardie was losing control of himself, while his opponent appeared to have no reason to worry at all. Eventually, curiosity overcame one of the servants. He crept along the corridor towards the room and bent down to the keyhole. The moment he looked through it, a brilliant flash struck him in the face. He stumbled backwards, crying out. In some versions of the tale, the eye he had placed against the keyhole was blinded. Then a voice came quietly from inside the room. The stranger knew that someone had been watching. Nobody approached the door again. Exactly what happened when the game ended depends upon which version of the legend survives. In one, Beardie loses his soul. In another, death brings him no escape at all. He is condemned to remain somewhere inside Glamis, sitting opposite the stranger he invited into the castle, and playing the same game until the end of time. For years afterwards, people said they could sometimes hear them. When the castle was quiet, angry voices were heard beyond walls, where no occupied room was supposed to exist. Beardie's temper had apparently improved a little with death. There were arguments, curses, and occasionally the sound of something striking the table. Then the voices would fall away, leaving only the quieter sound of the game itself, cards being dealt somewhere on the other side of the wall. That is the sort of haunting Glamis does particularly well. Nothing comes rushing down a corridor. There is no need for chains or screams. You simply hear something through a wall and realise that you have no idea what is on the other side. Other stories take place in the bedrooms. They belong to a time when night at Glamis meant genuine darkness, when the last candles had been extinguished and the fire had fallen low. A guest unfamiliar with the castle might have reached their room by following a servant through passages they could never have found again, alone. Once the door closed, there was little to do but sleep. Then something woke them. At first, there would be nothing to understand. Only the vague awareness that the room no longer felt empty. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, the shape beside the bed became clearer. Someone was standing there, leaning over the mattress and looking down at them. The descriptions have changed as the story has travelled and different identities have been attached to the figure, but the detail that matters has remained remarkably simple. The apparition was not glimpsed safely at the other end of a gallery. It was close. A sleeping guest opened their eyes and found a face looking down at them. It is difficult to think of Glamis without returning to its walls, because so many of its stories depend upon the idea that something has been concealed inside them. Builders are said to have discovered a doorway during work at the castle, only for the opening to be closed again, before its purpose could be properly understood. Another tradition speaks of an entire chamber that was not merely hidden, but deliberately forgotten. This was the room of schools. The story concerns members of the Ogilvy family, who during one of Scotland's bitter feuds supposedly sought sanctuary at Glamis. They were taken into a room where they would be safe from their enemies, and the door was closed behind them. Somewhere along the way, sanctuary became imprisonment. Nobody returned with food. Nobody opened the door. Whatever shouting came from inside eventually stopped. When the chamber was finally opened, according to the legend, there was nobody left to rescue. It is a brutal little story, and there is no reliable evidence that such chamber was ever discovered. Yet by the time the tale had become attached to Glamis, the castle had already acquired the perfect reputation for it. A locked door did not merely suggest an unused room. It suggested that somebody had once wanted whatever lay behind it to disappear. During the 19th century, that idea produced the strangest secret of all. The whispers said that one of those inaccessible rooms was not empty. Someone was living there. He was a member of the family. The story became known as the Monster of Glamis. According to the legend, a child was born to the Lyon family, who was considered so physically different that his existence was hidden from the outside world. Publicly, the baby was said to have died. Privately, the story claimed, he was taken into a secluded part of the castle, where only members of the family and a few trusted servants were allowed to see him. If the old tale is followed, he did not die in infancy. He grew up beyond those walls. Meals had to reach him somehow. Clothes had to be provided. Rooms had to be heated through the Angus winters. Servants moved through the castle, carrying out ordinary duties, while knowing that somewhere nearby was a man whom guests were never supposed to see. Outside, the estate continued as it always had. Carriages arrived, visitors stayed, dinners were served, children grew up. Generations came and went, yet somewhere within the same house, the legend says, another life unfolded almost entirely unseen. As the story spread, the hidden man became increasingly monstrous. Each retelling seemed to make his appearance more grotesque, until the unfortunate figure at the centre of the tale was barely human at all. There is no contemporary evidence that such a person existed, and the story belongs firmly to Glamis folklore. But the most disturbing part of it was never his supposed appearance. It was the room. A person could spend an entire life surrounded by voices, footsteps, music, and conversation, hearing a household living only a few walls away, while remaining hidden from almost everyone inside it. Once that idea takes hold, those unexplained windows outside Glamis becomes rather harder to ignore. Yet the castle's most famous ghost requires no secret room. She does not hide behind a wall, and there is nothing monstrous about her. Her story is quieter than almost everything else associated with Glamis, largely because the woman herself was real. Janet Douglas became Lady Glamis during a dangerous period in Scottish history. She belonged to the powerful Douglas family, and that connection eventually brought her into conflict with King James V. After the death of her husband, accusations gathered around her. There were claims of poisoning and conspiracy, before the charge became darker still, witchcraft. The case against Janet has long been regarded with suspicion, bound up with the king's hostility towards her family, rather than any convincing evidence of sorcery. None of that saved her. In 1537, she was taken to Edinburgh. On the 17th of July, Janet Douglas was led onto Castle Hill and burned to death. She died far from Glamis. The old stories brought her back. The chapel associated with the Grey Lady was built long after Janet's lifetime, which makes the tradition impossible as a simple memory of her worshipping there while alive. But folklore chose the chapel anyway, and it is easy to understand why. Compared with the great rooms of Glamis, it is intimate and enclosed. The surroundings encourage silence. A person kneeling in prayer would hardly attract attention. That is how the Grey Lady appears. Someone enters the chapel and notices a woman already there. She is dressed in grey and kneels quietly near the front, her head lowered in prayer. There is nothing alarming about her. She does not acknowledge the visitor or move towards them. She is simply another person sharing the room. For a moment, the visitor looks elsewhere. Their attention settles on the altar, a painting, a sound behind them, anything that takes their eyes from the kneeling woman. When they look back, she is gone. There has been no sound of somebody rising. No footsteps have crossed the chapel, and no door has opened. The place where the woman had been kneeling is simply empty. Tradition identifies her as Janet Douglas, the Grey Lady of Glamis. There is even an old custom associated with a particular seat in the chapel, said to be kept vacant for her. In a castle overflowing with extravagant stories, hers needs almost nothing. A woman who died far from home is seen kneeling quietly in prayer. And when someone looks twice, she is no longer there. That quietness suits Glamis. The castle does not need to look haunted. Its stories work because the rooms themselves are so ordinary. People have eaten in them, slept in them, argued in them, and raised families in them for centuries. The portraits on the walls are not decorations chosen to make the place atmospheric. They are faces from the family that lived here. The stairs were climbed long before visitors began searching them for ghosts, and the chapel was a place of worship before anyone came hoping to glimpse the woman in grey. Then you step outside again and look back at the castle. There are the windows. Once you know the story, it is almost impossible not to wonder which room belongs to which. Somewhere behind them, Earl Beardie's game is supposed to continue. Somewhere within the castle, a hidden man was said to have lived an entire lifetime. Somewhere, a door once concealed the dead. In the chapel, Janet's chair remains part of an old tradition that has survived long after the people who first told her story were gone. Eventually, the visitors leave and Glamis closes for the night. The rooms that seemed magnificent in daylight grow dark. The last voices appear from the passages, and the chapel stands empty again. There may be nothing beyond the walls, but old stone, forgotten alterations, and the confusion created by centuries of rebuilding. There may be perfectly ordinary explanations for every inaccessible corner and every window that seems difficult to place. Glamis has never needed very much more than that. Only an unanswered question about a room, a door nobody remembers opening, a table somewhere on the other side of a wall, two men sitting opposite one another, and in the darkness, the quiet sound of another card being dealt.
Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. It really does help more people discover the show. You can find more online at ghosttales.co.uk. You can support the podcast and gain access to exclusive content at www.buymeacoffee.com/ghosttales.